Today I'm gonna talk about something very important to me, something I hold close to my heart and something I cherish more than anything else. I'm not talking about friends or family or stuff like that. Those are pretty good to have, I guess, but there's something that I find even more important. Today I'm gonna talk about beer. I apologize in advance because I just might get a bit sloshed today. I can't really talk about beer without drinking any, can I? And today I have a very valid reason for drinking beer. Today is the third Wednesday in July, and that's a very special day in Sweden. This is the National Beer Day in Sweden. Not to be confused with the National Beer Day in the US, which takes place on the 7th of April every year, or the International Beer Day, which takes place in August. The US National Beer Day is the day to celebrate the Cullen-Harrison Act, which legalized sale of beer with an alcohol content of 3.2%. And the International Beer Day is celebrated on the first Friday of August every year and has the purpose of uniting the world under the banner of beer. The Swedish National Beer Day doesn't have any grandiose reason like that for existing. In 2012, Swedish breweries simply decided that, hey, we like beer, let's make up a beer day. So why the third weekend of July? No particular reason. Most people are on vacation then, so it's a good time to have a beer. Or two, or three. We'll see just how many I get through today. The biggest breweries in Sweden are Spendrups and Carlsberg, Sweden. Spendrups has a lot of subsidiary breweries such as Brutal Brewing and Gotlands Bryggeri, so it's definitely worth talking about. But I don't really want to talk about Carlsberg because it comes from Denmark, and I'm not talking about Danish swill in this video, I'm talking about Swedish beer. You can also find a lot of other big and small Swedish breweries such as Omnipollo, Nils Oskar and Poppels. Åbro is another big Swedish one with beers like A-Bro and, well, Åbro. They also make Rekorderlig cider. You can find that cider abroad as well, even though no one outside of Sweden knows how to pronounce it. Falcon is another classic Swedish brewery, but it was unfortunately bought by Carlsberg, so I guess that I have to talk a little bit about Carlsberg after all. Falcon comes from the town of Falkenberg, by the way, which means Falcon Mountain. Another company I should mention is Kopparbergs Brewery, maker of such classic beers as Sofiero, Höga Kusten and Swedish Elk Brew. Sofiero is a student favorite because of its mild flavor and its cheap price. And most people find it really funny to pronounce it Sofiero instead and pretend that it's a quality brew from Italy. There's a lot more to say about popular Swedish brands, but first, let's talk about the history of Swedish beer. Swedish beer dates back all the way to the Bronze Age, when people brewed beer and mead and flavored it with bog myrtle, probably to hide the horrible flavor. These days, lager beer is the most popular in Sweden, by far. You wouldn't believe it while looking at all the hipster pubs and microbreweries serving different types of ales in Stockholm, but 90% of all beer consumed in Sweden is lager. That didn't used to be the case though. Sweden mainly used to produce two different types of ales, svagdricka and starkdricka, also called double beer. Basically weak beer and strong beer. However, in 1843, Fredrik Rosenqvist af Åkershult introduced bottom fermentation to Sweden, and that kicked off the modern Swedish beer production. Beer in Sweden was traditionally brewed at home. Each farm made their own ale in relatively small quantities. I say relatively because people drank a lot of beer. On the island of Gotland, it's recorded that every nun got 14 casks of beer per year. That's basically 5 liters of beer per day. And at a state dinner in Stockholm, it's recorded that every person drank 10 liters of beer. 10 liters is out of my league, and to be honest, I don't think I could even drink like a nun. But the beer was much weaker back then, and they didn't really drink anything else. The water was undrinkable, and there was no tea or coffee or Coke Zero, so beer was what you had to drink, along with very salty food. Beer became much less popular in the 1700s though, and that's because people started drinking schnapps instead, Scandinavian vodka. But thankfully, all of that changed in the 1840s when bottom fermentation was introduced to Sweden and beer production really took off. The home brewing that had taken place was replaced by industrial brewing instead, in larger quantities and better quality. But you can still find svagdricka and other types of traditional Swedish ales today. They're just not very popular because there's so much more to choose from today. The list of most sold beers in Sweden looks pretty similar from 2021 up until today. Spendrups is always in the top 10, with beers like Norrlands Guld, Northern Sweden's Gold, and Mariestad, which doesn't mean anything, it's just the name of a town. You also find Åbro in the top 10, with beers like Kung, a cheap lager whose name means king, and the immensely popular A-Bro. They also have a beer called 5,2, 5.2, as in the alcohol percentage. And we mustn't forget about Kopparberg with the Italian quality beer Sofiero, or rather Sofiero, named after the royal palace Sofiero. The name basically means Sophie's Rest, and it was named after Prince Oscar II's wife Sophie of Nassau. And then I guess I have to talk about Carlsberg, Sweden, with brands like Falcon and Pripps Blå. Pripps Blå used to be one of the most popular brands in Sweden. It was introduced in 1959, and in 1987 they added the slogan, "Many of life's best moments are blue." Those are the most popular beers in Sweden, and the common denominator across all of them is that they're all lagers, and they're all pretty bad. Swedish beers didn't really have a stellar reputation in the 80s and the 90s. We're surrounded by beer brewing nations like Denmark and Germany, and even Norway is starting to get a good reputation for beer. Sweden, on the other hand, was a country that was satisfied with a cheap, flavorless lager. But things have changed since then. Omnipollo is a brewery that started in 2011 with a vision to change the perception of beer forever. I'm not sure if they've achieved that yet, but they've certainly helped change the perception of Swedish beer. Since 2021, they have their own brewery in Sundbyberg in Stockholm, and they also have several bars in Stockholm, Hamburg, and Tokyo. They're famous for their experimental beers and for their bold style. But there's a lot more than Omnipollo in Sweden. There's around 450 commercial beer producers in Sweden right now. Sweden has actually become the second biggest beer producer per capita in Europe after the UK. In the US and the UK, people often talk about microbreweries, but the term craft beer is more popular in Sweden. The size of the brewery isn't as important as the craftsmanship. And the craftsmanship in Sweden is still improving every year, with better IPAs and better saison beers, with better porters and more experiments in general. Sweden has gone from a country without taste to a major beer producer in the world. Even though I have to say that I really like lager myself. There's a lot of breweries in Sweden, and there are new ones coming every year. And a lot of people are doing home brewing as well. My sister and her husband are brewing beer in their garage, and there were people brewing beer at the midsummer celebration I was attending this year. There's beer brewing everywhere. We might see a lot of new craft beer companies pop up once these budding home brewers start going commercial. But it's tough competition in the Swedish craft beer world. Untapped had a survey of the best Swedish breweries, and of course you could find Omnipollo and Stigberget from Gothenburg there. But you could also find a lot of smaller breweries, like Nerd Brewing, Psycho Pipes, and Mariatorgets Microbrewery. And also Apex Brewing, All In Brewery, Brewski, and a lot of others that I haven't heard of. I'd love to give you some tips on where to find the best Swedish beer, but that's actually quite difficult. The very best beers, or at least the most interesting, are often sold in small quantities to small pubs all over the country. But if you're visiting Stockholm and want to get some recommendations, you should visit the pubs Akkurat and Oliver Twist and ask the bartenders. They have a lot more information and they're a lot more updated than I am. And I can guarantee that you'll always find a good beer at either place. I don't know what's gonna happen with Swedish beer in the future. If I did, I'd play the lottery. But it seems like we're in for a lot of new experimental craft beer companies. However, given the boom in home brewing, it would be interesting if things took a different turn. What if we return to a more classic style of beer production in Sweden, with lots of small farms and households, all selling their own unique brew? Imagine coming to Sweden and traveling house to house to try completely individual beers with completely individual flavors. But you shouldn't be doing it as a road trip and drive in that case, for obvious reasons. But most likely that won't be the case. But we'll still see more and more commercial beer companies as Swedish beer continues to evolve. And more people will enjoy beer outside of the standard lager. Either way, I think that Swedish beer has a bright future. Cheers to that. And that's about it for this little video about Swedish beer. I want to thank Derek Miller on the 3-Star Vagabond Facebook group for suggesting the topic. Now it's time for me to find one more beer and for you to like and subscribe. But most importantly, have a great day.